All right, we're live. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Thanks everybody for watching. It's a kind of remarkably sad and shocking day today. We learned that our dear friend and mentor Angelo Codevilla passed away last night, and we wanted to remember him sort of right away. And I know there are going to be many people who write things about Angelo and the importance of his work and how unique and great he was as a person, as a human being. But I just wanted to do something real quick with some of the folks who who knew him best, and that would be the folks at Claremont Institute. So I've got Ryan Williams, the president, senior fellow Michael Anton, and Lincoln fellow Kyle Scheidler, all very good friends. And I just wanted to have a little celebration of Angelo's life and work. So you can take it away, Ryan.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, we were just shocked this morning with this news. I've been in touch with the Codevilla family, and it's true, alas. Some sort of car accident of some sort when Angelo was on his way home to Plymouth, California. He lived in the Sierra foothills on his vineyard, a beautiful place. I was just up there in April, and he made some wine for family and friends and then sold most of his grapes. I'm writing a little remembrance for the American mind, as you said, Dave. We'll do a lot more in the coming weeks and months, including something in the next Claremont Review of Books. But this is nice. It's an opportunity to share some stories about Angelo and just appreciate him. He came here in, I think, 1955. I believe he was 9 or so. 11. Thanks, Mike. And really was the only one in his family who spoke decent English, sort of taught himself English by reading the New York Times. So he really kind of ran the family in New York starting at 11, and has been sort of a stalwart part of his family. He's got 5 kids, his whole family's life. There's a lot of people don't know this, but Angelo, it's crazy that he was killed by a drunk driver or something. We're not quite sure all the details, but Angelo had a heart replacement 15 or so years ago, maybe a little longer. The first one didn't take, so he's actually on his 3rd heart. He swam every morning, was a very fit 78 years old. He and his wife, Ann, celebrated a 50-year wedding anniversary just a few years ago, and they both still fit in their wedding outfits. So it gives you a sense of how hardy Angelo was. And this will come out in the coming months, but people, I think, don't appreciate how influential he was and how controversial he was in the best sense. I remember a Lincoln Fellowship. With a few friends of ours were in it, Dave and Kyle and Mike, you'll know, I think, who I'm talking about. But on the first day of Angelo's lectures, he said, "Angelo, I live with a lot of agency guys in Manassas, and they told me to deliver a message to you, and it's this." And and Angelo loved it. He loved it. He had CIA's number ever since he was a Senate Intelligence Committee staffer, and had realized that the deep intelligence state was incompetent in many ways and mendacious in thousands of ways, and he always let them have it with both barrels. So that was a fitting tribute from our friend, and those who knew him know that perfectly well. There's nothing he likes more than to be hated by the right people. So that's just a taste. But I'll shut up for now, and maybe Mike wanted to say something.
Well, he worked on he was the principal, I don't know what you call it, the staff director, but basically the guy on the staff who ran the committee side for the Senate Intel Committee. And I don't remember who the chairs were. This was back in the 70s.
Yeah, Angelo worked for Malcolm Wallop.
Okay. Right. So that's a really powerful position, to be on a committee, to be the staff director of the committee, and that committee in particular is very powerful. And this is just the immediate post Watergate, post so-called Church Committee, family jewels era, when a lot of the CIA's shortcomings were exposed in the early mid 70s. And the agency, or the whole intel community's view was, if you're for U.S. national security, you've got to, your role in this job is to protect us and to bolster us and so on. And he didn't see his role that way. And he gave him hell. I mean, he wanted to do real oversight, which is what his view Congress is supposed to do, and made many enemies. And then helped the Reagan team choose who. He was on the transition for Reagan in 80, as I recall, but didn't immediately go into the administration. But eventually, sometime in the middle of the administration, went over to the NSC to do intel there, and made even further enemies. And then after that, went to the Hoover Institution at Stanford, which is where I first met him in 88, long before, 6 years before I found Claremont. Didn't really know who he was. He was this guy working national security stuff at Stanford when I was across the bay. And I had friends at Stanford. I would go down there on the weekends, and they introduced me to him. He was a kind of he was a youngish guy then. So this, because we're talking 30 plus years ago. And he was working on a book then called Informing Statecraft, which I have over here on a shelf. If I had it, I'd pick it up and look at it right now. It's either 91 or 92, but that was his big project when he was at Stanford. And it's his deep think on how intelligence ought to work, and how, and its failings. And I bought it, and I didn't read it for a long time until I went into the national security bureaucracy about 10 years later. And then I finally read it, and I thought, holy smokes, what have I gotten myself into? But the more I compared my day-to-day experience with what he had said a decade before, the more it was really obvious that this guy had, as you said, Ryan, he had their number. And that's why they hated him. I remember he tells a story in that book, I think it's in the introduction, where he's at a panel somewhere, years after his service is over. They're discussing reform, and some senior CIA figure, not quite a director, but somebody way up there. This is a public, like an APSA panel, a public panel, gets so exasperated and fulminates against him, screams at Angelo, "You don't give a damn about the CIA," which Angelo replied, "Yeah, I mean, you got me. I don't. If you guys can do it right, then I'd like you more. But until that point, I'm going to explain to you what you're doing wrong, and we're going to see if we can get this right." And that's a book that, to the best of my knowledge, never came out in paperback, is out of print, probably hard to find, but it's really a landmark. It deserves, especially in light of everything we've learned since 2015 and beyond. I mean, it's more relevant than ever.
Yeah. I forget what the event was, but when he was on that staff, he has described to me, maybe he's put this in print, I don't know. His light bulb moment was he went digging around in the old CIA station reports from Italy, I think around the post-war period or something. And, Angelo, of course, native Italian, spoke and read Italian quite well. And he sort of was reading through them, and then he figured out that the station chief was just parroting the newspaper reports from Italy. And back at CIA headquarters, I mean, nobody really knew Italian, so nobody could figure out how this lazy apparatus was supposed to be offering solid intel on how to understand a country, was just phoning it in. And so that was an early revelation for Angelo.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I remember. Kyle, if you want to jump in, I know you had tweeted a little a little story.
Yeah. So Angelo was a Boston University professor emeritus for a long time, and he was at Boston University when I was an undergrad there, and I took every IR course that I could find, anything at any kind of high level, and I just ate up everything. And I never took a course from Angelo, to my eternal shame, because this was the period of the lead up to and then the Iraq War. And I had this vague notion in the corner of my mind that Angelo Codevilla was an anti-war professor, like he was some kind of leftist or something. And I'm so stupid. But it goes to show you how different he was, and how he represented a different way of thinking about things than we've seen in our discourse for generations now. Where, during this period, there was really only sort of the neoconservative rah-rah freedom way or the highway in terms of how you were allowed to think about this stuff on the right, such that I, a young, stupid person on the right, wasn't even able to recognize what Angelo was actually talking about. And I think that situation is even worse today, where we've got a lot of young people who are rightfully sick of the way that the things have been run, and they just want to chuck everything overboard. And knowing that Angelo was out there saying, like, actually, this stuff is important. Statecraft is important. Intelligence is important. But there's a right and a wrong way to do it. And he understood that, and he challenged these people who were doing things in the same dumb way over and over again. But he didn't chuck the baby out with the bathwater. He didn't say, that it's not important that we have a country that is capable of defending itself and understanding who its enemies are and understanding the world that it operates in. It just needs to be done in a smart way. And I think he's one of the few people out there, or he was one of the few people out there that held that standard high for a long time.
Well, our friend David Azrad, who couldn't be here because he's traveling, but he called me this morning to, just reminisce about Angelo. And he asked me, he knows that I teach this NatSec stuff, and I assign a lot of things to undergrads. And I assign a lot of Angelo to my class, to both my undergrads and my grad students, and including, summaries of the basic positions, realism, neorealism, international, liberal international, whatever. And he says, well, obviously you can't call Angelo a neocon. What label do you put on him? What was he? And I thought for a second. I said, that's a good question. And the answer is you can't. It just, none of them fit. Right. Clearly, he was realistic in ways that so many conservatives are not. But you can't put him in the straight up Hans Morgenthau / Walt Mersheimer camp either. Right. So another book, I'm trying to remind people that he wrote a lot, and many of his books are not as well known as they should be. So one of them, I did look this up in the dust jacket this morning. It's 1997. It's called The Character of Nations. It's sort of a regime catalog, broadly understood as to say it's this recognition before, 5 years before neoconservatism really took off in a very fruitless direction, saying all people are the same and we can kind of make anyone into anything, saying no, the deep roots, history, geography, culture, religion, and all this stuff of a people affect how they behave, how they see the world, and then they affect how much what your policy can do to them. So you can't just go in anywhere and assume a blank slate. He wrote that, obviously writing it in 97. Keep in mind, too, that Angelo was trained to be an academic, and I think he finished his degree in 65, anyway, in the mid-60s. And he goes into first the Foreign Service, then the Intelligence Service, and then Senate, and then the White House, and he comes out. So he has a more than 20-year, almost 25-year detour from his academic training to starting to put it into practice, in which he didn't write any books. So he starts writing books very late, and he managed to turn out some incredibly impressive books having done that. So on the one hand, he's a realist. He doesn't have any of these naive, dumb assumptions, but he's also not what I think Kyle was getting at, that sort of dogmatic realism of restraint, which says, any perceived threat is fake. And as long as a tank isn't rolling across our border at this precise moment, we don't have to worry or do anything. Angelo, after 9/11 happened, the conservative movement, I was going to say, was confused, which unfortunately we would have been better off had the conservative movement been confused. Instead, what it did is it went completely, and Kyle, you spoke of your eternal shame. We can now speak of mine. It went all in with the Bush agenda immediately after 9/11. We're gonna fight them there, so we don't have to fight them here, and we're gonna democratize their countries, and we're gonna create the universal and homogenous state or whatever. Claremont Institute was one of the few holdouts to this on the right, institutional right, and the intellectual right. And I don't think these have ever been put into a book, but it would be worth doing. Angelo was in the CRB every quarter for 5 years or something immediately after that, from the very beginning, explaining what the Bush administration was doing right and wrong and why certain things wouldn't work. And I can remember people asking me, I need to, what's the conservative alternative to what the Bush administration is peddling? Because I'm just not easy with this, but I'm not quite okay with, the Pat Buchanan view either. So what's kind of this other way? I said, well, it's Codevilla and CRB, and people would come back and they'd read it, and a good half of them would come back and go, oh well, I didn't mean something like that. That's way too far. That's crazy. I said, well, look, you asked for a serious alternative. This is the serious alternative. He's given it to you. So if it makes you uncomfortable, that's not because it's not serious. It's because maybe you're not ready for it.
Right. I've told this story, I feel like many times, but that was my first exposure to both Claremont and to Angelo, which is picking up a copy of CRB at Tower Records in Lower Manhattan shortly after 9/11 and seeing one of those pieces, and my mind exploded because it was so different. It was so outside of the Acela corridor box of conservative, the conservative media was presenting. It's interesting because prior to that, Angelo had been a frequent contributor to commentary, but you never saw him in commentary after that. And it seemed like there was an entire strand of American foreign policy thinking that the Claremont kind of exemplified, and nobody exemplified it more than Angelo himself. That was almost like it was like Dos Passos out of the canon. At the time, because if you're one of these neocons at the Weekly Standard, for example, the last thing you want to do is give any oxygen to someone like Angelo. You want to present the only alternative as being, the isolationist alternative or the Buchanan alternative, which you can, which has both its, merits and shortcomings, but whatever you say about it is easy to caricature. And for that reason, they airbrushed Angelo out of the critique in real time, which was a kind of scandalous thing.
Well, the old Norman Pod commentary, especially, and the Neil Considine commentary was very different than what commentary became. And when the Weekly Standard sort of took over the mantle of neoconservatism, especially in post 9/11, they went in different directions. Commentary didn't seem to really represent, like the commentary of 1990 when I was in college and the first Gulf War happened. You knew that was the serious voice of Republican foreign policy, or the tough-minded side of it. That wasn't so true anymore by 2001. Not because commentary had changed, but because other voices had just kind of drowned it out. But in a way, Angelo's always a Claremont guy. I mean, he got his PhD from the Claremont Graduate University. School as it was called then. He really made a name for himself in the last 5 years or so. He's got people. I was looking at Dave, your Twitter feed, and a couple of others. I'm sure I'll be punished for this because I always disdain Twitter, but I was looking to see what people were saying, and it's heartening to see people. I don't necessarily know them, but I'm sure most of these accounts I'm looking at, these are people a decade or two or even three younger than I am, talking about him, right? And they don't know him through these books or through any of this stuff. They know him from, like, if you guys remember, in the fall of 2016, shortly after Claremont, we did the Flight 93 election. Within like a month, 3 weeks, Angelo published After the Republic. Remember this? Right.
Yep.
And then some of the great things he's done for American mind and American greatness in the last few years, or even in the last year or 6 months alone, have gotten what was the piece on Our Revolution's Logic in American Mind, like 2019. And there's some stuff just from the last 6 months that have gotten amazing attention.
The COVID coup.
Right. Yeah.
Was huge.
Such focus on his work that, in a way, this was his moment. And that's one of the great tragedies that this, it had to happen. Did it have to happen right now? Who am I to question these things? But I certainly wish it didn't.
With our time, the culmination of two strands. One is Angelo's work on the nature of the ruling class, and the other is To Make and Keep Peace.
Yeah,
which was a book that Dave showed me, and it's even before I went to Claremont, really got me into Angelo. And I would call Dave up and I would start reading to him from the book. And Dave's like, I know, I've read the book. Like, I told you to read the book. But it was so amazing because he understood how the failure abroad would come home.
Right.
And in terms of the security state and all of the logic of it, he saw all of that And he paired that with the nature of the ruling class. And I think those two critiques coming to a culmination really is why he was this perfect voice for this period that we're going through.
And he like Mike Yeoman, another one of our dearly departed senior fellows, longtime professors at the summer fellowship programs, you know, he had this rare combination of practical experience in government and also an academic mind and that deep scholarship. You know, Angelo, they're out of print now, but you know, he translated The Prince, Machiavelli's Prince. I think his dissertation was on Charles de Gaulle that he turned into a book. Angelo, you know, read and spoke Italian, Spanish, French, English, read Latin, probably had a smattering of Attic Greek as well. You know, you had asked, I asked him 10 years ago at least at one of our fellowships. So, you know, what would be the best preparation for really knowing founding foreign policy and how it ought to be applied today and the things it teaches us? And Angelo would say, you know, read John Quincy Adams's correspondence and diaries, all of them. And that, you know, that's like 10 or 12 or 15 volumes of stuff. So he was a learned man and a man who had actually practiced in the real world. Yeah,
I have some direct experience with this because I have to teach, you know, the founders on foreign policy in a lot of different venues, and I assign the obvious things, you know, Declaration of Independence, Washington's Farewell Address, Federalist 11, the Report on Manufactures. You could guess what the basic texts are. So Angelo was supposed to teach the Lincoln Fellowship this summer, and he got sick and he couldn't come. And I was asked if I could fill in. I said, sure. I know what readings I would use, but it was too late. This was like a week before the books had been printed. The readings were out. Couldn't change them. So show me what he was doing. It was all not JQA speeches. It was letters and diary entries, pages and pages of it that I had not ever looked at. Most of some of it maybe, but I sat down comfortably in an armchair at my parents' house and I read through all of it. And there's a lot in there to mine. I've never done what he did and gone through, you know, all of these volumes. I don't know if I'll ever have time to do, but it's impressive that he could do that, and the things he could find in it were amazing.
Yeah, he's got we'll have to figure it out, of course, with his heirs and the literary state such as it is. But he was going to publish in spring. I hope we can still help make it happen. A volume for Encounter Books, Roger Kimball's excellent project that Mike's published under, among other things. A book on sort of what is America First foreign policy. So the Office of Net Assessment in the Trump Defense Department, a couple of them asked Angelo this question, you know, can you write us a memo on what America First foreign policy is? So Angelo, being Angelo, he gave them 75,000 words like 4 months later, which was first two thirds, what would John Quincy Adams do and why Adams was a genius. And then the last third, what does that mean for today and America First foreign policy today? So that we'll get that out in some fashion, and it'll be an inadequate but a fitting tribute to a lot of his work.
And I mean, I know Mike brought it up, but like even in the last, we need to mention the ruling class.
Yeah.
Which is something that, you know, I mean, I didn't put to when that first came out, I didn't put it together with, you know, the immediately with the foreign policy Angelo that I was reading. But you know, I mean, that was a piece that took the world by storm, or took the American right by storm, thanks to Rush Limbaugh, you know, in the same way that Flight 93 did.
Yeah.
And,
5 years before Trump. I don't remember the month, but it was 2010. And it really shook up everything and got people to, like, he figured out what the Tea Party was all about before anybody did. And he turned it into a book, and you could see the groundwork being laid for all the stuff that he was working on, you know, in these last few years. I want to say one thing before I forget, which is, I've seen some stray comments from people, you know, quoting him out of context or even in context, as if to say, well, let's not be too generous to this bad man who said bad things about, you know, whatever. I said Angelo was a Claremont guy through and through. Even in these later works, you will find that he will, while he's talking about foreign policy and defense and regime corruption and all of these things, he will state with crystal clarity what he thinks the basis. You know, when he talks about the ruling class, he divides them between essentially the city and the country party. And he says the center of gravity for the country party is its belief in basic equality and rights is the same way the founders understood it, and this is what they want to defend, and this is what they feel is under attack. He never veered from that, ever, in any piece of writing that I ever read or in any conversation that I ever had with him. So it's particularly, I think there was some justified anger in the way he wrote about it, in seeing these things under scurrilous attack from people who didn't really believe in them and were being disingenuous, claiming to defend them and claiming to attack him from departing for them, when he, I was going to say felt, but when he knew he hadn't moved an inch. So I'd like to say on his behalf that I get a little angry when I read people attack him on, the day of his announced death for saying, well, but look at him saying this and this, and he's not really a friend of our democracy. He advocates these things, when what he was advocating was a defense of the very thing that he stood for his whole life, and was trying to rally other people in that defense. So, to those of you trying to take a little piece out of his reputation on this of all days, you could at least try to do so honestly and not distort what he said and what he believed. I know that's beyond your capacity, but to those of you who have a conscience, think about it before you tweet again.
Yeah, I mean, amen. Though it's probably too much to ask of some of these bottom feeding folks who have turned people like Angelo and others and their life's work into into kind of an opposition research field day. But it's interesting to note, though, that I think Angelo, more than really anyone else I can think of who's influential or who has been influential on the right, he never really gave his enemies that much of an opportunity to misconstrue what he's saying, which itself is I mean, if you're triggered by Angelo, then it's kind of like, your problem. You're admitting to something.
You would see, Azrad and I were talking about this today too. You would see him, and again, he was on his third heart. He had some health problems. He had slowed down. He wasn't in conversation or in person. You'd think, oh, just go tend the vines. Like, it's okay. You've earned it. And you think maybe you kind of passed his prime. And then the next piece would come out and you'd read it, and the clarity and the sharpness of it. And it's just like, there was no sense of any kind of slowing down. There was no sense of losing his edge. There was no sense of forgetting anything. Or it was just right there, as if you were 50 years old or 30 years old, as sharp as imaginable. You're like, okay, I look forward to the next one after you read that.
Yeah. I mean, I said to him recently, why don't you put together every piece that you've done from After the Republic onward? Because it's actually a coherent, it would make for a very coherent set. And like, 5 minutes later, he sends me this, this 4,000 word summary of the collection that he that he had, in mind. And the way he wanted to organize those pieces.
And the people who'd get mad at him for writing things like that, they never tried to say, here's why Codevilla is wrong and why the Republic is functioning as it is supposed to, and all the guardrails established by the Constitution and other norms are still in place, and this is all alarmist, and here's the evidence with which I back up these assertions. It was just a kind of hysterical, screaming point and stutter. Look at this bad man. He shouldn't say these things. He's anti-democracy. Well, is the man who warns you, Cassandra-like, that democracy is under assault before our eyes and maybe dying before our eyes, is he anti, or is he so pro that he's trying to stir you out of your torpor to get you to do something positive to try to save it? And tweeting about threats to our democracy from clear-eyed analysts like Angelo Codevilla, I don't regard as a serious or even good faith defense of democracy.
Right.
Well, and I think Angelo's history in dealing with the intelligence community and so on played a role in his ability to understand early on that a lot of these institutions had maybe never earned the respect that they were being given, but certainly at this point in the game did not deserve some of the protection and support that they were getting, even from conservatives who, of course, by nature are very institutional and support institutions and support law enforcement and generally support the military and the intelligence branches. And he understood very well that a lot of this at the top level had never been what a lot of us thought that it was. And it would, I know a lot of Lincoln Fellows whose favorite memory of Angelo is the Angelo debates with John Yoo. And especially at Lincoln, where you've got a lot of guys and gals who are, have made their careers or are making their careers. They maybe have some institutional experience. They have some buy-in maybe to the institutions. To see their eyes get opened up by what Angelo was able to tell them, sometimes they couldn't compute it, and it was so fun to watch because they would argue with him and yell, and he would never raise his voice. He just very calmly being like, "You know so many things that aren't true,"
I think I was the only. It was me and Angelo and Brian Kennedy, and and Ryan probably too, and everyone else in the Lincoln class that year was opposed.
Yeah, it was me in my Lincoln year. It was me and Megan O'Para and I think maybe Chris Rufo, and who were all on Angelo's side and jumping in to support him. But he would say these great things to rile people up, about. He had a thing about hanging the Assad family that particularly sparked outrage, but the underlying point, the sort of fundamental principle, was always totally based and totally accurate. Like, it was always based on something real about human nature, right? And I think that his understanding that you couldn't have all of these fancy international relations concepts, and you can do that if you want, but at the end of the day, if your foreign policy isn't based on something true about the way human beings interact with each other, you're not going to succeed.
Yeah.
I mean, this was his moment in more ways than one. The Russia hoax and everything that came out of it, all the intelligence. I mean, just think about the most recent intelligence failure. The Taliban won't be able to take over the country for at least a year, and we don't need Bagram Air Force Base. All disproved within, I was going to say 24 hours. That may be generous. Maybe it was 12. Whatever. We'll give them 24. Hell, let's give them 48. It was disproved within 48 hours, right? But if you're not ready yet to accept the bankruptcy or at a minimum the serious deficiencies of this $70 billion behemoth, or however much it costs now, you'll never be ready. But he was ready, and he was telling us, like I said, long time ago, and people ought to pick up Informing Statecraft, read it, or his very bold American Mind piece about how to reform these communities from, I think it was this year. It's certainly not more than a year old. Very long, detailed, told you everything you needed to know about how to do it and why. He's certainly been vindicated. I mean, few people are vindicated by concrete, indisputable events so thoroughly the way he has been recently.
He tells the story of arguing against a young Scalia who at the time was advocating for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and Angelo basically back then predicting exactly what would happen, to Trump with using FISA, and that it would immediately become a weapon that would be too irresistible for the deep state to resist, and it would only mischief would follow. And then you guys mentioned, or Kyle mentioned, knowledge of fundamentals and natural law. Even he wrote this piece for the CRB just a few years ago called "The Natural Laws of War and Peace" or something like that. One of his insights into Afghanistan was birds fly, fish swim, Afghans fight. That was the thing you had to understand.
That gets back to the character of nations. He would be willing to say things like that. if you tried to say that in an NSC meeting in the Bush White House in 2001 or two, you'd certainly be fired. You might even be hauled away in handcuffs. No, you can't talk about people like that. If all men are created equal, that means we all want the same things, and the same regime will suit all of us at all times. And we were talking about his writings. I'm going to mention a couple that occur to me. So one CRB article recently, within a year or 2 years maybe, was about Russia and what U.S. relations should be with Russia. And he writes this after 3 years of this collusion fantasy. I think part of which was designed, of course, to get Trump out of office. A partial success, we may say. But part of it was designed to prevent any kind of rapprochement, any kind of easing of tensions between the United States and Russia, any kind of reevaluation of the relationship, to keep the fundamental NATO myth that even after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia is still the greatest threat to Western Europe, as if the tanks will roll through the Fulda Gap the moment we leave our guard down. And he explored it this is the Angelo's realistic side. I'm not putting a label on him because he can't, but his realistic side was, okay, let's look at concrete interests between what are Russia's concrete interests, or at a minimum, what do the Kremlin perceive them to be, whether they're right or wrong? What are ours? Where do they line up? Where do they clash? And where are certain of our interests and their interests they're irrelevant to one another. There's no Venn diagram, so we don't really have to worry about what they're doing in this space, and they don't have to worry about what we're doing in that space. How could we make this better? He goes into that better than anybody I've ever seen. And another, I don't know if anybody's familiar with these, but I like them. Many of them are very good. ISI published these super short, like not only short, but small little books. So they're slim and they're small. Student's Guide to whatever. So, and they're written usually by very prominent scholars. Well, Angelo wrote the Student's Guide to International Relations. And it's both a grand tour of how to think about IR, and it goes into culture, and it goes into climate, and it goes into geography, and a lot of things that people just don't want to think about, regime type and stuff like that, history. It goes into ways and means, and it's also supported by an incredibly impressive bibliography at the back end, where he tells you what to read, and just in a sentence or two about each book, he tells you why. Like, where does this fit in the canon of all of the of a systematic way to look at international relations? And the thing is less than 100 pages easily, and 100 small pages. You can sit down and read it in an armchair in an hour or two, as I did when I first got it. And it's an education in and of itself.
Yeah. All these things should be available. We should put together some kind of a resource library of some kind, where people can have access to this. I mean, I know a lot of it is out of print, but it's still available on. I mean, you can still find it used on Amazon or things like that. But it would be good to collect the pieces that he wrote, in addition to the ones he wrote for American Greatness and CRB, the ones he wrote, for example, for commentary or for other outlets. Yeah. Let's fall through the cracks.
There's also a good long interview with him on tablet called the Angelo Codevilla tapes. They do these series of interviews, and it really captures his verve and his intelligence pretty well.
Yeah, and the Samuels introduction is worth the price of admission alone, I think. Yeah. Anyway, we've been going for a little over a half an hour. But I wanted to kind of wrap up this kind of first pass. I know that as I said, we'll be talking about him and writing about him, and I know many folks will.
Brian Kennedy just texted me, Dave, that he's going on Bannon's War Room today to talk about Angelo, so people should check that out.
Beautiful, excellent. He was one of a kind. He was one of our most important Americans of the time. I can't think of anyone else who for such a long stretch has gotten so much right and has been prescient about so much. Really, the most consequential things he was most prescient about, which is kind of no small feat.
I'll just say in closing, not to take the spotlight off of him, but just to show you that people like him, if they are not produced by, they are certainly shaped by an environment. And I think that had he not had the education he got and had the teachers he had and met the friends that he had, if you think about the extraordinary constellation of people that are around him that came up through grad school with him, that remained his friends throughout his life, that remained interlocutors, that, you know, would take the first pass at his book and give him the comments. And, you know, if he hadn't had that band of brothers in a way, you know, he wouldn't have been Angelo, I don't think. And none of us would be us, and none of his friends would have been him. I mean, he was sui generis in a sense, but he also wasn't just, you know, he didn't kind of grow up out of the ground, out of nothing. It does give you the importance of these schools and these institutions, and finding like-minded people, but not like-minded people who agree with you on everything and who are working on the same things and think the same things, but like-minded so that there's a common basis for criticism and comment, and they can make you better and show you things that maybe you didn't think about. And he was in that. He had a circle like that, as did so many of our friends, his whole life, and it made him better, and it made all of us better.
Yeah, we should, just for the historical record, also just note, Mike knows a little more about this than me, but maybe not the personal stories, but I'll just leave it at that. Angelo, for reasons of sort of networking and curiosity, was at the center of the Strategic Defense Initiative and the beginnings of space-based missile defense, which sadly we still don't have, but would be a real asset to America and to the West.
Yep. Anyway, thank you for thank you for joining me here. I want to say thanks for watching, and God bless Angelo.
Indeed. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Dave.